We are live. It is Friday. Boy, do I have a lot of catching up to do. I've been in the hospital, or was in the hospital, I should be saying more accurately, for the better part of, oh God, almost 4 months. So, pardon me if I kind of go all over the map in terms of what I'm talking about. I could be talking about, play by play. I could be talking about TV, radio, internet, streaming, chicken soup, Chinese food, baseball, hot dogs, whatever. So, I'm kind of sporadic, and I'm very, very impulsive. So oftentimes I might be thinking about something and am so passionate, that could be good or bad, that I want to say something right away. And I think a lot of you will resonate with that, which is one of the reasons why, in a short amount of time, in doing this media beat, which I used to write for a lot more lengthwise time as opposed to doing my YouTube show, I would think of things and they would come about my up here. And I'd say, God, I wish I could just say that. Right now, I've been thinking a lot about the great, great play by play voices we've had here in the Bay Area. And a lot of these voices were nationally renowned, right? Like a Bill King or Lon Simmons, Hank Greenwald. For God's sakes, Al Michaels, if you can remember way back in the mid 70s, mid to late 70s, Al Michaels, before he made it really big, was part of the San Francisco Giants radio broadcast team. So there's quite a bit of history and historical, edifice in regards to voices, TV or radio, etc. So with that said, and with that in mind, um, my feelings about Joe Starkey are something that I'll probably, people will give me crap for. Some people agree with me. But if you're not on the fence and you have kind of a bit of objectivity in your mindset, then hear me out. Okay. I loved listening to Joe Starkey. And Joe Starkey, those of you who don't know, he retired about 2 years ago. And Joe was hockey guy, did a lot of work for the Seals when they were in the Bay Area. And Joe also was the voice, of course, he was the voice of Cal football and Cal basketball. Um, and of course, the San Francisco 49ers. He even at one point did hockey, not just the Seals, but when they were here in their early years, Joe did TV play by play for the San Jose Sharks. But my fondest memory of Joe, and keep in mind, Joe's very much alive, lives in Walnut Creek with his lovely wife, he's got a son and all that. My greatest memory of Joe Starkey was when he was doing Cal football. And me growing up in the 70s, I loved to listen to Joe talk and make jokes and do Cal football. Because keep in mind, look, Joe got a lot of flack because oftentimes there were periods where, there'd be brief interludes, not about the game. And Joe would be doing scene setters and talking about the stadium or talking about what it was like to get inside the press box or, kind of a Bill King-esque kind of a moment. There are times that Joe got ripped for his style and all that. I was one of those people. I wasn't as hard on Joe because I realized quite late in the game, no pun intended, that oftentimes Joe and his color guy, whomever that was seated on the 30-yard line and didn't want to rely upon TV monitors and had to rely upon his own viewing, whether it was binoculars or whatever, or plain naked eye visual optics, which can make viewing the game difficult and all that. But I loved Joe growing up in the 70s and he doing Cal football. And remember, that was a very, very powerful time for Cal football. Now, they never made it to the Rose Bowl post, what was it, 1958, which is a tragedy in and of itself. But I loved listening to Starkey because he just had a distinctive style and it made me laugh. I'll never, ever, 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 ever forget the time when and remember Jim Selania? He was a TV sports guy at Channel 7 in the late 70s into the early 80s. Anyway, he was doing color commentary on Cal broadcasts. And he and Joe were doing a Bears game up in the Palouse country, Washington State. And it was one of those days where it was windy and it was raining cats and dogs and the stadium was antiquated and all that. There was just miserable conditions. And Joe on the air was making a mockery of the conditions, and the ball was flying overhead and sometimes behind the players. And it was funny. I tuned in just to I didn't care about the game, frankly, because Cal was crappy that time. But Joe was talking about being, and Selania too, being in this miserable, old, antiquated stadium, talking about the conditions. I laughed my ass off. There was things that they were talking about that you can only get. You couldn't get that today because got to talk about the game. You got to live in a bubble. But Joe was the preeminent descriptor of the so-called scene setter, the game within the game, the outside conditions, the weather, goings on. I remember Cal in the late 2000s, or maybe it was right around 2007, so it wasn't exactly late. Remember the whole tree saga? Don't cut down that tree, yada, yada, yada. And Cal was playing one of those Southern teams, I think Oklahoma or what have you. I don't know about who they were playing, but they made a big stink about cutting down a tree. And Joe talked about that. My point is, I can't listen to the broadcasts today because it's all rudimentary shit, right? It's all the game. And the current guys, Justin Allegri, who I had great thoughts for. I thought he was going to be poignant and interesting, not necessarily provocative, but my point is, it's like Justin Allegri is in a bubble. And look, does he have the merits of the game down? Sure. But the guy doesn't know how to set a scene. He rarely talks about things other than what's going on in the game. And you might say, well, isn't that what he's supposed to be doing? Yeah, but there's no aura. There's no provocativeness, if that's a word. I just made it up. And that's what Joe Starkey did. And those are things that I love. You could say the same thing, although maybe a little bit more from a technique standpoint, more pronounced and more effective. That was what was so great about Bill King and Lon Simmons, and who could forget the humor of Hank Greenwald, is these guys could set the scene, and they injected humor and wisecracks, and they could be wise asses in the case of Lon Simmons. And you listen, you laughed. These days, it's either these mediocre misfits who wouldn't know anything off color if their life depended on it. And look, I'm not saying you got to be controversial and act like a jerk. I don't mean it like that. Matter of fact, I think most of you know what I'm talking about. We listen to Bill King because we love Bill King lampooning some jerk in Seattle at a basketball game who threw his vodka and it hit Bill in the face or something. And he talked about the flavor of the vodka. Or he made mincemeat of NBA referees. Remember when he was doing the Warriors? And now we have this imposter, this jerk who calls himself a broadcaster doing the Warriors now. What's his name? Fitz, aka Rudy, doing the Warriors. He's horrible. But Starkey could set the scene. Starkey would talk about outside things and all the while be quite fine doing Cal football. Now, look, I know a lot of you say, I missed this call. He was always, as his receiver. Oh, what a bonanza. Well, you know what, folks? I loved all of that. Thought it was funny, thought it was poignant, thought it was interesting, thought it was provocative, was worth listening to. Yes, Joe Starkey moved the needle. Some of you saying, what the hell are you smoking, Lieberman? What's the deal? Well, just listen. Go get some old tapes. I'm not even referring to, mind you, the famous play. Remember back in 82, the famous play, big game, Stanford Cal, 1982, Joe Cap's first season, and Joe going berserk. It was funny. You know, people say, well, what would have happened if Bill King had called that? Or such and such. You know what? That was such a crazy play. That was such a bizarre, totally out of this world moment. You know what? I think Joe Starkey captured it entirely apropos of and indicative of just how nutty that play was. So for me, it worked. Look, Joe has said in many interviews since that time, it wasn't one of his prouder moments. And that's Joe Starkey being the broadcaster as opposed to Joe Starkey as witness to one of the most zaniest, bizarre, absolutely out of this world, as I keep referring to, moments in the history of not just college football, but indeed, I mean, the entirety of sports. I thought it was a perfect description of something that was quite unthinkable, but yet it happened. So why do I miss Joe Starkey? Because Joe was a perfect example of setting the stage, setting the scene, visually descriptive, offering some off-field, off-court parlance that made turning on the radio when people actually listened to radio worth tuning into. And Joe, as I said, very much alive, living in Walnut Creek with his lovely wife. And it just came into my mind, had to act upon it. You may agree, you may disagree. Look, that's what they say makes for interesting watching, viewing, reading. That's why we're here, right, folks? Anyway, I miss Joe Starkey, who, by the way, have you heard those ads on the radio? Speaking of radio, KCBS, yikes, termites. Who could ever think that termites would be so compelling a subject matter? And Joe Starkey does these ads for this termite company, and I laugh my ass off when I hear them because, well, you just have to listen. And if you're chuckling when you hear the term yikes, then you know what I'm talking about. If not, well, turn on the radio. I'm Rich Lieberman. It's Friday. I will see you later. We got a whole bunch of things to talk about. We're also going to talk about referring to myself as we. Wonderful. I'm going to talk about a lot of things because I got a whole lot of catching up to do. And believe you me, become a subscriber to my channel here on YouTube. Tell your friends, your enemies, your priest, your rabbi, your lawyer. Tell them that Rich Lieberman is back on the air and raring to go. Yikes.